Every truth hides a darker secret.
Night. April 1912. The Atlantic stretches endlessly. No lights. No shadows. Only stillness, cold as a mirror between worlds. The ship moves forward like a city that decided to cross the ocean. Titanic. A name that would become a symbol of pride, progress, and perhaps, a curse. In those days, people believed that humanity had conquered nature. A steamship that could not sink. A machine built to defy the very elements. It was not merely a vessel, it was a statement. A metallic manifesto declaring that mankind now stood above fear. On board, over 2,000 souls. Aristocrats, emigrants, businessmen, journalists. Each carrying hope, a new beginning, a secret. And with them objects that would one day become legend. Paintings, gold, jewels. And, some say, a sarcophagus. An artifact that was never meant to leave the soil where it was found. This story doesn't begin with water or with ice. It begins much earlier. With an object that once stood in the halls of the British Museum. An Egyptian funerary panel known as the Unlucky Mummy. A sarcophagus said to bear inscriptions forbidding anyone to disturb the dead. Everyone who came into contact with it, the legend claimed, fell ill, lost everything, or died under strange circumstances. Newspapers wrote about photographers whose cameras broke, curators who suddenly lost their sanity, travelers who perished soon after seeing it. It was an artifact that did not like to travel. And when rumors spread that this very relic had left London, bound for America, the world was ready to believe. In that April, everything seemed perfect. The weather, clear. The wind, gentle. Passengers enjoyed a level of comfort that even kings of the past could only dream of. Music, candles, gold, porcelain, laughter. The press called it a triumph of civilization. No one doubted that the ship would reach its destination. But beneath the glitter, there was another layer. Rumors. One of the passengers, journalist and mystic William Stead, told friends before departure that the cursed Egyptian mummy was on board. He claimed to have seen the sarcophagus in the museum, heard the stories of death, and said that it was now bound for New York. She will bring misfortune, he half joked. A few days later, he drowned in the cold waters of the Atlantic. After the disaster, people remembered his words. And the wave of rumor began. The sarcophagus had been hidden in the cargo hold, shipped secretly, unregistered. And when the ship struck the iceberg, a sailor supposedly saw the lid, ancient wood, floating on the surface. A golden mask glimmering above the waves. It sounds like a beautiful legend. But legends rarely appear from nothing. Curses are not for the dead, they are for the living. When something so unjust, so senseless happens, we need to believe there was meaning behind it. Even if that meaning is terrifying. And perhaps that is why the story of the mummy clung to the Titanic forever. It became a metaphor for human arrogance. As if by taking from a tomb what should have been left untouched, mankind provoked not the wrath of the sea, but of something far older. Not coincidence, but consequence. Not nature, but retribution. Yet, like every legend, this one has two faces. The story that is told. And what lies beneath it. For beneath the mummy's curse are real documents, real names, real events. And in them, no fewer mysteries than in the myth itself. More than a century has passed since then. The ship rests on the ocean floor. But the legend still floats on the surface. And if you listen closely to the silence of the Atlantic, you can almost hear. Not water, but a question. What if it wasn't just a shipwreck? The legend of the mummy that supposedly cursed the Titanic began long before the ship ever set sail. Its roots lie in the very heart of Victorian England, an era when archaeology was less a science and more a hunt for miracles. The late 19th century. Europe was in the grip of Egyptomania. From tombs and temples, like treasures pulled from the chests of time, came sarcophagi, statues, amulets. Each discovery was a promise of fame, sensation, fortune. But along with them came something else to London: fear. Fear of that invisible boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Whoever disturbs the eternal sleep shall never again find peace. The Times, 1889. That was written about the so-called unlucky mummy. An Egyptian coffin lid decorated with the image of a priestess. The find was dated to roughly the 13th century BCE. It contained no body, only the lid, a painted wooden panel, covered in hieroglyphs, and the serene face of a woman, whose eyes seemed to follow everyone who passed. The artifact entered the collection of the British Museum. Officially, it is known as Catalogue No. EA 22542. But it quickly became famous for reasons far from scholarly. People connected with it began to fall ill, lose loved ones. Some even died. The first death spoken of was that of a museum photographer. He had taken a picture of the artifact, but the developed plate came out ruined. A week later, he died under strange circumstances. Soon after, a journalist wrote that one of the museum's curators, who had worked near the mummy, went mad and took his own life. Later, it was said that a woman who purchased a replica of the piece was killed in a carriage accident. The horses bolted, as if from fear. Coincidence, perhaps. Or simply the way that era gave shape to its fear of the unknown. But newspaper headlines multiplied. And soon the unlucky mummy gained a new name: the Cursed Priestess. The British Museum officially denied any notion of a curse. Their reports were straightforward: wood, paint, resin, nothing unusual. Yet visitors swore that in the gallery where it was displayed, the air always felt slightly colder, as if the very stone around it held tension. Years passed, and the legend lived on. By the early 1900s, newspapers were writing, "The priestess brings death to anyone who dares take her from Britain." And that is where the story became immortal. 1912. A rumor appeared. A wealthy American collector had purchased the sarcophagus, intending to ship it to New York for his private collection. The cargo, it was said, was sent under special discretion, omitted from official manifests. Some claimed the museum sold the artifact anonymously to rid itself of the curse. Others said it was shipped through intermediaries, and the buyer never knew exactly what he had obtained. Around that same time, a man named William Thomas Stead appeared in London. A journalist, editor, mystic. He believed in the afterlife and in communication with spirits. He wrote about telepathy, about curses. And once, in an interview, he said, "There is in the museum an object that brings death to all who touch it. If it were ever carried across the sea itself would rise against mankind." A few weeks later, Stead bought a ticket on the Titanic. On board, he told fellow passengers about the cursed mummy, and said that it might already be aboard, in the lower cargo hold, among the antiquities bound for America. Witnesses later confirmed it. Yes, he spoke of it over dinner, smiling, but with that kind of seriousness that belongs to people who half believe their own jokes. When the Titanic sank, Stead was among the dead. And that's when the myth took form. Newspapers declared he foretold his own death. The cursed mummy went down with the ship. Ancient gods avenged the plundered tombs. London was gripped once again by Egyptian fever. This time not because of discovery, but because of dread. People came to the museum, stood before the display case, and whispered, "She sank the ship." But every legend has its paradox. The artifact numbered EA 22542, the unlucky mummy itself, had, in fact, never left the British Museum. It was never shipped overseas. It never crossed the sea. It was never listed on any Titanic manifest. It remained exactly where it had always been. in a cool hall smelling faintly of old wood and dust, where even today visitors sometimes stop, suddenly aware of the feeling that someone is standing just behind them. Thus was born a myth in which everything converged: ancient fear, modern catastrophe, and the name of a man who spoke of a curse and died, as if to prove his own words true. Perhaps the mummy never left the museum. Perhaps it was only coincidence that its legend and the Titanic's fate met at the same point in history. But from that moment on, their two lines became one. And ever since, whenever the Titanic is mentioned, somewhere nearby, there is always a whisper: the curse of ancient Egypt. The story of the Titanic is not just a story of a shipwreck. It's a legend, one that feels as though it was written long before it happened. Too many coincidences. Too many premonitions. Too many people who knew but could do nothing to stop it. Perhaps that's why the tragedy of the Titanic has never felt like an accident. It feels like a warning. 14 years before the disaster, in 1898, a writer named Morgan Robertson published a novel called Futility, or The Wreck of the Titan. The story reads like a prophecy. A massive ocean liner, deemed unsinkable, collides with an iceberg in the North Atlantic. In April. Aboard, the wealthy, the elegant, the privileged. Music, luxury, and not enough lifeboats. Thousands die. The difference between Titan and Titanic, only 4 letters. Even the ship's size and speed were nearly identical. Robertson wrote, "Man's pride cannot float upon the sea unless nature herself allows it." When the catastrophe struck, the book was reprinted, and thousands said he predicted it. Robertson denied any mysticism. He claimed he had simply studied the trends of modern shipbuilding. But the feeling remained, as if someone had seen the future and left behind a rough draft. There were other oddities aboard the Titanic. Several passengers canceled their tickets the day before departure, citing a bad feeling. Some crew members later admitted they had felt a strange unease before the voyage, a sense of dread they couldn't explain. In a surviving letter, one first-class passenger wrote, "I don't know why, but this ship feels too proud, as if it doesn't belong to the sea." That sentence was later engraved on the wall of the museum in Southampton. People are always searching for signs. When something terrible happens without warning, we can't accept that it's just chance. We need to believe there was intent behind it, even if that intent is dark. And so, the Titanic's destruction became a hall of mirrors, full of prophecies, coincidences, and those who swore they had felt it coming. One of them was our familiar name, William Stead. He wasn't only the man who spoke of the cursed mummy. A year before the tragedy, he had published an essay describing a shipwreck where passengers died because there weren't enough lifeboats. He even called for a law to ensure that every vessel carried enough boats for all aboard. No one listened. On the night of the disaster, they say, he helped women into lifeboats, then went back inside to the saloon, where witnesses later recalled he sat calmly in a chair, reading the Bible. Whether myth or truth, his story fit perfectly into the legend. The man who warned and was the first to die. In the same circles where the Titanic was mourned, there were whispers of spiritual predictions. A London medium claimed that a week before departure, she dreamt of a great white ship sinking among floating slabs of ice. Others said that on the eve of the disaster, radio operators, pioneers of a brand new science, had received strange signals, as though someone was calling for help from the future. None of these accounts can be proven, but they all share a single truth. They're not about facts, they're about fear. Fear of progress that moves too fast. Humanity had built something so perfect, it had to test its own limits. Later, the engineers admitted The ship was going too fast. The captain, a man of flawless reputation, was on his final voyage before retirement. He wanted to prove that human intellect could command the ocean itself. The Titanic sailed with its head held high, as if it could not see the warnings ahead, as if it believed itself immortal. The irony? People on deck were joking about it. Even God himself couldn't sink the ship. That phrase would later become a symbol. The very words believers would call the curse. Pride before the fall. On the night of April 15th, when the lookouts finally spotted the iceberg, it was already too late. 50 seconds, that's all that separated eternity from impact. On deck, the music played. Laughter echoed. Passengers thought they had simply brushed against the ice. But within a minute, the ship's steel hull split open like a wound, and the ocean poured inside. The rest is history. But this was the moment a legend was born. When people heard of the Titanic's fate, they didn't just grieve. They searched for meaning. Why? How? What could explain it? How could something declared eternal die? And that's when three stories merged into one. The ship deemed unsinkable, the writer who foresaw its doom, and the ancient mummy said to have gone down with it. From that fusion, a myth was born. Not about a ship, but about human arrogance. About the desire to outgrow our own limits. About the fact that the world does not forgive those who start to believe they are gods. The Titanic became a mirror. Everyone saw something different in it. Scientists, the failure of engineering. Believers, divine punishment. Poets, the tragedy of love and fate. And mystics, proof that the universe always answers when humanity forgets who it is. Even after the sinking, the story continued. Newspapers searched for symbols. Artists painted the iceberg as the hand of God. And ordinary people lit candles in their windows. Not just for the victims, but for that single moment when the ocean reminded the world that it is still alive. When official reports no longer satisfy, theories begin. People cannot accept that humanity's most perfect creation was destroyed by a piece of ice. And so the Titanic became more than a tragedy. It became a conspiracy. The first and most famous theory, the ship switch. In the early 20th century, the White Star Line owned two nearly identical liners, the Olympic and the Titanic. The Olympic was built first, and after just a few voyages, it was badly damaged. In 1911, it collided with the Royal Navy cruiser HMS Hawke. The insurance company refused to pay compensation, claiming the Olympic was at fault. And so, the theory says, the company, teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, devised the fraud of the century. According to this version, the damaged Olympic was secretly renamed Titanic, and the real Titanic was quietly written off as the Olympic. Externally, the ships were almost identical. The porthole numbers matched. Only a few interior details differed. Details that could easily be changed in a matter of weeks. Then comes the darkest part. The fake Titanic, meaning the old Olympic, was sent into the Atlantic with a weakened hull. Its accident staged to collect insurance money and save the company. The passengers were real, but the plan was supposedly to stage a minor collision, to be rescued by nearby ships. With no one hurt. Something went terribly wrong. It sounds like a movie plot, but it has its believers. In the 1990s, researchers comparing photos of the Olympic and Titanic found inconsistencies. Porthole placements that didn't match. Bulkhead numbers corresponding to the wrong vessel. Even traces of old dents. Some claimed White Star Line destroyed part of its documentation. Others insisted The ship lying at the bottom of the Atlantic is not the Titanic, but the Olympic. Skeptics counter this easily. Every component on the wreck bears a serial number, all matching the Titanic. Even underwater, decades later, archaeologists identified factory stamps that could never have been forged. But for those who believe in the switch, even that is part of the cover-up. Then comes another theory, the banking connection. Among the Titanic's passengers were three of America's most powerful men: Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidor Straus, and John Jacob Astor IV. All three were opponents of the creation of the Federal Reserve System, the future central bank of the United States. According to legend, they were the key figures standing in the way of its formation. The owner of White Star Line was J.P. Morgan, financier, magnate, the very man who would later help establish the Federal Reserve. He was the Titanic's chief investor and canceled his trip at the last minute. His ticket had been purchased, his suite prepared. But Morgan fell ill and stayed on shore. His three opponents died. Coincidence? Or a carefully executed plan? Official historians dismiss it as nonsense. No evidence supports it. But the logic is hauntingly elegant. The richest man in the world builds a ship as bait, invites his enemies aboard, and removes them from history with a single stroke of ice. Too symbolic not to endure. And then, there's another layer, the esoteric. Some occultists of the late 19th century believed the Titanic was a ritual vessel. Even its name, they said, was no accident. Titan, the children of Earth, defeated by the gods of Olympus. Perhaps the ship's name itself symbolized humanity's rebellion against the heavens. The industrial age defied nature, and nature answered. Even the ship's very design. 13 compartments, 16 bulkheads, 4 funnels, 1 purely decorative, is sometimes interpreted as a magical number, a symbol of order, sacrificed to chaos. Others claim the Titanic carried gold, bound for New York's banks. That some of the cargo was never listed in the manifest. That the gold was never found. Some whisper that one cargo hold contained Egyptian artifacts. Not a mummy, but relics inscribed with texts of eternal sleep. That an explosion in that hold may have hastened the ship's destruction. None of it has ever been proven. But none of it can be entirely disproven either. And that is why the myth survives. Conspiracies are not about truth. They are about need. The need to explain why the mighty fall. Why the safest can become the most helpless. Why progress, meant to save, sometimes kills. The Titanic became more than a ship. It became a symbol. The end of an era. An era when humanity believed it controlled everything. After 1912, the world was never the same. War came. Empires collapsed. Faith in the infallibility of technology shattered. Perhaps there was no switch. No curse. No grand conspiracy. Perhaps it was all just humanity's way of preserving dignity in the face of its own fragility. But the myth of the Titanic endures because it makes the disaster meaningful. It turns accident into story, death into symbol, chaos into lesson. And maybe that is the real answer. It doesn't matter whether it's true. What matters is that we want it to be. Because myths comfort us more than reports. And legends live longer than facts. At a depth of nearly 4 kilometers, it is cold, dark, and silent. There is no light there. No time. Only the remains of metal, covered in rust and salt. The ship once called unsinkable is now a home for coral and shadows. The Titanic has lain there for more than a century. And if one could truly listen, perhaps they would hear not just the sound of water, but the breathing of memory. In 1985, explorers finally found her. What was once thought impossible became reality. The ship was found. And it turned out, it hadn't disappeared. It had simply shifted into another state. Somewhere between life and legend. Scientists described the hull. Journalists wrote about the tragedy. And the world once again wept. But beneath all the words, something else remained. A question that still echoes from the deep. Why do we need so desperately to find meaning? Even where there may be none? Perhaps because without meaning, we don't know how to live. When faced with the abyss, humans throw words into it. Curse. Conspiracy. Substitution. Prophecy. Any explanation is better than silence. And so, the myth of the Titanic became not a lie, but a way to stay sane. A story where fear becomes faith. And faith becomes a form of memory. Every generation tells this story differently. For some, it's a lesson in pride. For others, a tragedy of love. For others, still, a sign from God. And for some, just a beautiful metaphor. That every ship, no matter how great, still sails on the waves of time. The Titanic became a mirror, where we see not the sea, but ourselves. Our confidence. Our naivety. Our hunger for control and fear of chaos. People often ask, why does this story still hold us? Perhaps because it reminds us that no steel can shield us from fate. That no technology cancels the fragility of life. Because behind every disaster, behind every number in every report, there are eyes and hands, and a song that was never finished. They say the Titanic's orchestra played until the end. Not out of heroism, but out of humanity. They knew the ship was sinking. Yet they kept playing. Because in a world that was falling apart, music was the last form of faith. And maybe that's why this story endures. Because it reminds us, everything we build can die. But everything we feel remains. Today, the Titanic is no longer just a wreck. It is a temple beneath the sea. A monument to everything humanity can create and lose. They say if you stare long enough into its portholes, you can see a reflection. Not of people, but of a past that refuses to be forgotten. And maybe that is the answer. Stories like this are not told to frighten, but to remember. If stories like this speak to you, not about ghosts, but about people. Not about fear, but about meaning. About what makes us alive. Then you are already part of this journey. Leave a like if you heard something of your own in it. Subscribe, so you don't miss the next story. And tell me in the comments, what do you think happened that night? Coincidence or warning? Because the Titanic was never just a ship. It's a symbol. A reminder that no power makes us immortal. But as long as we remember, it still sails.